Squats are more important than deadlifts, and you know it's true, so don't try to deny it. What's up guys, Enkiri here, and today I want to talk a little bit about squats and deadlifts and the relative importance of each type of movement. So I got a very interesting question on one of my videos last week that really got me thinking about this topic. But before I get into the video, please remember to hit the like button so we can get some of that sweet engagement. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy the content that I make, please be sure to smash the subscribe button as well, and check out EnkiriEliteFitness.com for details regarding my online coaching as well as my kick-ass training programs. Now let's take a look at the question. So he wants to know, could you do a video on which lift is more important out of the squat and the deadlift? Personally, I feel that a good squat and rows carry over well to everything, but the deadlift, well, not so much. So I think my response is going to be a little bit juicy. Maybe I'm wrong. You can let me know if you think that it's a tame take or a hot take in the comments. Doesn't make any, never mind to me either way, because I'm going to assert what I'm going to assert regardless. Now, I have to say, for me, at first glance, this question actually seemed pretty innocuous, right? I didn't actually really think very much of it initially. The off-the-cuff answer is kind of that neither movement's more important than the other. You should do both, get good at both, yada, yada, yada. But that's the off-the-cuff, lukewarm, politicized answer. But then once I actually got started thinking, really thinking about the depth of this topic and analyzing not only how my own training has evolved over the years regarding these two movements, but also how I tend to train other people who do not wish to specialize in any particular event, I began to realize that the squat is actually far, far more important than the deadlift. Now, for the purposes of this video, we do have to make a few assumptions. So here we're referring to the conventional deadlift done from a dead stop on the floor, which is, an actual deadlift. We're not referring to things like RDLs or even touch and go deadlifts, which are really just kind of different beasts, right? And we are not referring to sumo deadlifts either. Those don't even really have a place in this conversation. If the question was, what's more important, squats or sumo deadlifts, then you wouldn't even get a video response answer. You would just get a virtual slap in the face. Now, we can also include things like stiff leg deadlifts and even deficit deadlifts in our mix of acceptable deadlifts for this conversation for the purposes of this video, as these are both resembling the conventional style and they're generally pulled from a dead position on the floor as well. So they basically satisfy this same true deadlift criteria. On the other hand, for the squat, I am basically referring to any standard squat variations you've probably seen, right? So here could be a front squat, a back squat, a high bar squat, low bar squat, SSB, pause squat, pin squat, etc., etc. If the hips and the knees bend through a full range of motion with the bar on the back or the front of the shoulders, and then you stand back up with it, then that's a squat, and it satisfies the criteria of a squat while offering the benefits that this awesome movement pattern confers. Another assumption we have to make in this context is the individual's training goals. In this case, obviously, if you're a power lifter, then neither lift is really more important than the other. I mean, you could argue that in raw powerlifting, the deadlift is actually more important than the squat because it typically accounts for a larger percentage of the total. Dun, dun, dun. But both lifts are basically equal tier in powerlifting. And the same kind of goes for strongman, right? In a competitive, not that they're equal tier, that the deadlift is more important, right? In a competitive sense, the deadlift is probably more important than the squat because they do more deadlifting types of movements, more types of carrying different things where you always have to kind of pick shit up off the floor to start what you're doing in strongman. However, in reality, I would argue that a stronger squatter probably becomes a stronger strongman than a stronger deadlifter, all else being equal. That is a big, hard qualifier right there, all else being equal. So don't take two different guys, compare their squatting strength and their deadlifting strength, and then tell me that I'm an idiot. But it's not really my bread and butter here either, so I'm not going to die on that particular hill either. The hill I will die on, however, is the hill for the generalist, or in my case, that hybrid athlete concept that I always talk about, or even just for average Joes who want to improve their overall fitness as much as possible, right? So here's where I'm standing. For these people, ones I just mentioned, becoming a master squatter is going to take you a lot farther in the long run than becoming a master deadlifter. I do not have any scientific data to back up this claim. It's based solely on feel, experience, and observation. Now, using myself as an example, because that's the easiest example I can give you guys, and you guys aren't paying me to come up with difficult examples, so using myself as an example, I'm going to go with the most basic argument of all. The squat drives up the deadlift, but the deadlift does not drive up the squat. If my squat goes up, my deadlift probably went up too, at least assuming a reasonable amount of time to acclimate to the actual movement and create a transference of those gains. But if my deadlift goes up, there is no chance that my squat simply went up by default without actually really training it or pushing it hard, right? I don't know why this is, but if I had to guess, it's probably in large part due to the ranges of motion. The deadlift uses more weight, sure, but in terms of joint angles, it's essentially a partial for the hips with just a tiny smidge of knee flexion to go along with it. The erectors get hit harder in a deadlift, although they do still have to work very hard to maintain rigidity in a squat. The hamstrings are actually left kind of underwhelmed by both movements. But deadlifts do not build up the legs, and they do not take the hips through a large enough range of motion to build widely transferable strength in the glutes either, or to necessarily really even induce all that much hypertrophy there. Now, the legs and the glutes are probably the most important muscles in the body. You get far more overall development of those muscles from pretty much every single squat variation than you do from deadlifts. The vastly greater range of motion and the sharper joint angles leads to more hypertrophy and creates strength that yields a larger degree of generalized transferability, whereas the same is not necessarily true of the deadlift with its abbreviated range of motion. The deadlift also has a tendency to wear you down, to beat you up, to make it where you can't consistently train hard with any level of frequency or volume. If you really know how to push things, you can actually make yourself toast for 3 weeks, 4 weeks. I've done this with a single set of deadlifts. Now, this is anecdotal, but pretty much every single lifter agrees that heavy deadlifts are simply harder to recover from than heavy squats. It just kind of is what it is. The deadlift beats you down in a way that the squat doesn't, which means that you cannot train it as hard or as heavy or as often, which if we're weighing one against the other, means that the gains that you can make from the deadlift are going to be limited as compared to the gains that you can make from the squat. You can just do more squatting, which means you can make more gains. It's even possible that the deadlift will also actually hamper the gains that you could have otherwise made from squatting by creating a recovery deficit that becomes very difficult to manage. And I have had lots of people who I know of who've had this complaint. In fact, one of the very first things that I do with a lot of the guys who come to work with me is drastically reduce the amount of weight that they're deadlifting, because they end up constantly shooting themselves in the foot by pulling more than they should be pulling on a regular basis. So it's just a more precarious balancing act to manage, which means that it's easier to get wrong more often. Now, in my own training, I've drastically tapered down the amount of deadlifting that I do over the years. At first, when I was a bit younger, one thing I started to naturally begin to gravitate towards was higher volumes on the squat and lower volumes on the deadlift, right? Especially as my deadlift got stronger, because what I found was that the absolute gains that I was making were better when I was squatting more and deadlifting less, as opposed to the inverse. And I've tried doing it both ways, trust me. However, that was even when my goal was still to have a big squat and a big deadlift. Now my goal is really neither of those things. It's really just to be as generally physically fit as possible. And with that goal, the amount of deadlifting, true deadlifting volume that I perform is basically zero. I deadlift sometimes for fun, but that's about it. It is more for fun and less for what I would consider the sake of progress. So where my hybrid athlete, my jack of all trades progress is concerned, my actual posterior chain work focuses on hinging exercises, not on deadlifts. And then the squatting variations that I do still take priority over all of it because they simply fuel the engine to the greatest extent. In terms of my clients, I have found a healthy balance between the two movements when the goal is an equal improvement of both, or the long-term maximal improvement of both. And that balance actually often heavily favors the squat over the deadlift. I would say on average, 2/3 of the main lower body work is squat volume, whereas 1/3 is deadlift volume. And again, for most people, this simply seems to yield better progress over the course of time, i.e. greater gains. Now, that's not to say that I haven't run into a few dudes who could handle the relentless pounding of moderate or even high volumes of deadlifting over long periods of time, because I have run into people like that. But even then, the balance never exceeds an equal, a 50-50 ratio. But those dudes are far less prevalent than the amount of dudes who simply they do much better when the balance favors the squat over the deadlift. So is this anecdotal? Yes. Is this all bullshit? Maybe, but maybe not. I'll let you guys decide. But in my opinion, squats are more important than deadlifts. They drive more gains in the long run. They're more well tolerated by more people, and they create strength that transfers over into a much greater array of activities and endeavors as compared to deadlifts, while also promoting joint mobility, especially if you use ATG, ranges of motion, deep ranges of motion, at least as deep as you're capable of. I talked about that in a recent video. And they induce greater muscular hypertrophy in those most important muscle groups in the body. Now remember, this is just one man's opinion, so if you have a deadlift fetish, don't let your panties get too wadded up today. A little wadding's okay, but excessive wadding, probably something you want to avoid. But then again, that shit's usually pretty funny. So if you're fuming behind the keyboard right now, you can feel free to tell me all about it. Anyways, all I got for today, guys. I hope you found this one informative, but most of all, I hope that this one really made you think. That's the goal here. Please remember to smash the like button before you go. Leave me some love in the comments down below. Check out EnkiriEliteFitness.com for online coaching and training programs. And as always, keep training hard. Happy Friday, bitches.